I just want to remind you that this is our monthly race class with Professor Jonathan Feingold of Boston University Law School. And in case you need to have your memories refreshed, legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University Law Professor Jonathan Feingold and me, Arnie Arnesen, a radio talk show host, are having a monthly conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. As Jonathan said, quote, "We know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means." We are now Race Class episode 11. So the title of this series is Race is a Story that Justifies Inequality. So thank you very much for doing this and being so incredibly sharing with your time and energy and knowledge. And I'm really grateful on this day before Thanksgiving, which is the day we tape. You begin by saying race is socially constructed. We say the words, but what does that mean? So let's refresh everyone's recollection, because we've sort of said this before, but you know what? You can't say it enough. And the best way adults learn, just like children, is through repetition.
Yeah, so let's jump into that in a second. And let me, I guess, first start by saying thank you for having me, Arnie. It is always a pleasure to be here with you, given how hard the world remains in all sorts of ways. And the impetus for this show, legislation across the country that was trying to censor honest conversations about race and racism, does not seem to be slowing, but if anything, maybe seems to be picking up. With that, let's use this space to have an open, honest conversation about this thing called race. And I'll just share that. So this semester, I'm teaching two classes. One is a seminar with about 16 students on critical race theory broadly in a law school. And one of the first questions that I asked the class is, what is race? And I don't just say that rhetorically. I mean, tell me. You're all sophisticated thinkers. You're reading a lot. What is race? And it's really hard to answer that question. And I don't ask them that because I want a particular answer. And even like in all sorts of respects, the answer is not what I'm going for. Though certainly it's important that by the end of the semester, we are better equipped to answer the question. What I'm trying to provoke is just the basic insight that this thing called race, that we often take for granted, really is a super complex social phenomenon. And that we have to understand, or we have to study it if we want to be able to understand it or even say what it means. That's, in a sense, a bridge to today's conversation. And race is a story. So among other things, race is a story that helps us make sense of the world. For better and often for worse. And hopefully by the end of today's conversation, folks will have a better sense of what that means. But let me pivot or start by asking you a question, Arnie. You've been taking race class for 11 months now. And as you started said at the top of the show, we know that race is a social construct. We can say those words, but it's often harder to say precisely what that means. But as a predicate question, let me just ask you this. So we know race is a social construct. Does that mean that race isn't real?
Yes, it's real. And as you point out in your outline, it's real like taxes are real, like roads are real. They exist. Taxes exist because they were created by humans as a way to raise money to pay for government. Roads exist because we decided where the grid should be to move people around through transportation. So in a lot of ways, we control what that is. And that means, yes, it exists, but it exists because we have actually given it definition. We have given it determination. We have supplied with it how you understand it. But understand the operative word is we have sort of created what you now know as an understanding of what a tax is. And that means it exists, but what does that mean? It exists because of my definition, not because it necessarily exists out there without my definition. Does that make sense?
So that makes total sense. Taxes are a great example. Taxes do not pre-exist the culture that creates them. They
Yes,
don't,
exactly.
in the same way that race does not pre-exist the culture in which it's created by humans to serve a particular function. Now, my guess is, if you're super wealthy in this country, you actually don't have to worry about taxes. But for everyone else, they are very real, and notwithstanding the fact that they are, in every sense, socially constructed. There's a lot of different ways in which we can think about what it means for race to be socially constructed. And I think it's helpful for us to run through a little bit of a review where I will draw on the work of specifically Jerry Kong, who has helped to operationalize how we might think about race. And he disaggregates race into three different components. You have the categories. So you, for example, white or black or Asian. So
Right.
one component are the categories.
Right.
Another element of race are the gatekeeping rules. So the social rules that determine who gets into which category. Oftentimes we associate race with skin color or ancestry, but never are those the only signals or cues that we are relying on to put people into different categories. There's also really interesting research coming out soon by Hakeem Jeffries and others at Stanford that show that there's many other attributes that function as gatekeepers, which include anything from accent to someone's spouse to their political affiliation to their experiences with discrimination, and that individuals racialized as black and individuals racialized as white actually apply different gatekeeping rules. And the main insight is that this is all socially constructed. The categories we determine, the rules that dictate who gets into which category we determine. And the third element that Professor Kong, a friend of the show, identifies are the racial meanings. That is, the meanings that we associate with the categories.
So
The,
let me just stop you for a second because I was reading your outline, and this goes directly to your point, and I'm maybe jumping too far ahead. The categories as you just described them. You don't even need facts when you've got this category called race. The racial story alone does the explanatory work. Race writes the story for you. Oh my God. I read that sentence and I'm like, oh my God. That when you ask what is race, I went back to race writes the story for you. And in some ways you were trying to push me into that. That's the problem. It isn't, is it real or is it that it does, you don't even need to explain it. All you have to say black and certain things get identified. You say white and certain things get identified. You say Asian, you say Jew. And the problem is it writes the story for you, whether the story is real or Memorex.
and so let's take so that's a important
Oh,
point that we'll keep digging into, but let's take a half step back. So
okay.
social constructs, roads, taxes, they're constructed to serve a particular purpose.
Exactly.
We have limited resources. We're not going to expend energy just creating things that don't serve a particular function. And we shouldn't be so limited in our imagination to think that race only serves one function. But if we, go back a couple hundred years, one of the key functions race and its storytelling aspect was doing was to justify slavery in a broader social order that was defined by hierarchy. And there, the racial meaning was not just to suggest that there are then we would think of as biological differences between this group that is white and this group that is black, but the meaning was essentially a rubric that suggested white is better than black. And the purpose was not just to describe the groups, but to justify the social order, to legitimize racial hierarchy. And so that's the function that race as story tells. Now, we can think about, and it might be helpful just to think about sort of this interplay between meaning attached to a group and how that functions by actually shifting the conversation to gender. And oftentimes it can be easier for us, for various reasons, to have these conversations through a sort of gendered lens than with respect to race. But when it comes to racial meaning, we can ask a number of questions. I'll just put three on the table. One, what are the meanings associated with a group? Two, what determines those meanings? Like, is it statistics? Are the meanings that we associate with group, is it just, raw numbers? Does it have to do with demographics? Is it rather media portrayals? Is it a function of what the New York Times is writing every day? Is it a function of what's happening on TikTok or other sort of venues of social media? So that second question is, well, where do those meanings come from? But then the third, which is really our focus today, is what is the consequence of those meanings? What is the story that they tell us about the world? And that last piece, we can break up a little bit. So we know that meanings, one thing that they do is they just describe a group. It's not about individuals. It's about the group. It's about describing the group. It's not to suggest that the description is accurate, but it's a description. But the power comes not from the description itself, but because that description then operates to explain different groups' relative position to one another. And when those positions are marked by some sort of hierarchy or inequality, oftentimes the socially salient descriptions, the meaning, justifies that unequal position. But then it also informs the solutions we might identify to remedy inequality. And now to make this more concrete, let's actually shift to gender a little bit. So assume two things for me, Arnie. Assume there are two genders, male and female. And I know this is somewhat reductionist, but assume there's two genders, male and female. And now assume also that men are overrepresented in positions of leadership, power, and prestige. Probably don't need to assume that latter point. Do you have any sense, Arnie, what the breakdown is in the Senate? It's a body that I think is marked by, we would think of it as leaders, powerful positions. What the gender breakdown is, at least as of last year?
I don't know, is it 80-20? Is it 80? I mean, I know it's going to be overwhelmingly male because it's been overwhelmingly male. And if we waited another 150 years, it wouldn't be 50-50. So what, no, I don't know what the actual numbers are. I mean, I'm lucky. I come from a state where there are two female senators. So you need to, and I'm going to take some credit for that as being the first girl to run for statewide office. And then after I ran, all these women ran and they all won. But what is the actual breakdown?
24 women.
That's close, 20.
So 24, yeah, no, so you're really close.
Yeah.
And so, like, descriptively, that's the number. That's like if we're just counting bodies.
Right.
In 2021, 24 out of 100 senators were women. Now, assume, and Arnie, you can tell me whether this is like an appropriate assumption, assuming that societally we tend to associate men with leadership more than we do women. We associate men with agentic traits like industriousness, ingenuity, whereas we associate women with, support roles, with caretaker traits. Is that an accurate assumption?
Jonathan Feingold, it's 1992. I'm speaking at a chamber of commerce. I've just given a speech on the economics. I'd won my primary. Here's the first question I got at the huge chamber of commerce dinner. They call on this guy at the back of the room, and this is his question. Excuse me, lady, have you ever held a job? I have just won the primary with more votes than anyone in both Democrat and Republican history in my state. And that is the first question I get. Okay, you think it was gender defined, that question? And so I looked at him and there was a gasp in the room. And my answer was, well, actually, no. I woke up one morning and I said, should I bake brownies or run for governor? Too bad the brownies were only 78 cents. It would have been done in a half an hour. And then I looked at him and I said, here's the problem. You're looking at a young woman with a short skirt and you're assuming daycare teacher. You're assuming someone who waits on your table. You're assuming someone who's taking care of your elderly parent in a nursing home. What you don't see is someone who's been a legislator, who's been a developer, who's been an advocate for whatever. And I went through the whole list of things and I smiled at him and I said, I understand the question, but here's the good news. I want to be governor and you'll get used to it. All right. So you're absolutely right. I've lived that question. And people in the room heard that question. And it was gender assumed because he assumed when he saw a young woman, he would never have asked a man that question. But he felt he had the right to ask me that question. And that right came because I had breasts.
And so I really appreciate you sharing,
Oh,
such a personal account with us that can just sort of help us just, in a way, sort of just feel how this sort of association, which maybe is not quite as sticky now as it was then, but is still incredibly pervasive. It's not just describing different groups, but it's explaining an
yes.
unequal distribution of power, in a sense, rationalizing and justifying it by at least, at a minimum, the implicit suggestion that men are overrepresented because they just make for better leaders, because they deserve it. And so that's like the step two. It is not just describing the group, but it's explaining the unequal distribution of power. But then step three, well, then what is your prescription? If you still think that's problematic, your prescription isn't going to be, well, we should identify all of the structural and other forces that push men into these positions and keep women out. You're going to say something like, I don't know, women need to be better leaders. Women need to be more like men. Because if you are suggesting that the source of the inequality is a deficiency that women for some reason have, then the solution ostensibly is going to be focusing on remedying that deficiency, not focusing on all of the other factors that actually create that imbalance. And so that's a nice moment for us now sort of to pivot to race. And I want to situate us in post Jim Crow America. So it's after the fall of our formal American apartheid, though obviously we can ask, how much changes. But imagine it's the late 1960s or the early 1970s. So now you have formal laws that prohibit legalized racial hierarchy, at least formally. And the notion that race is biology is beginning to get undercut, certainly in the academic literature, even more socially. There's this notion that, race is socially constructed. It's not a biological fact. But you still see massive inequality between Americans who are racialized as white and those who are racialized as black. And so a question becomes, well, what explains that persistent inequality? And you can no longer say it's biology. It's, among other things, politically, it's no longer acceptable to suggest that. And so, well, one thing that you might suggest is that it's still trading on the same racial meaning that before was tied to biology. Now you might suggest that, you know what? Well, it's not biology, it's culture. And the reason why certain communities of color remain underrepresented in positions of power and prestige, continue to quote unquote underachieve in different settings is because of it's just cultural inferiority. And of course, there are competing explanations. One being that most of the forces that created the racial hierarchy that defined Jim Crow actually haven't been displaced. And so predictably, they would continue to produce the same result. But the key is that now we are moving from biological explanations for racial inequality to cultural explanations. And if your goal is to both justify and preserve the social order that defined Jim Crow, and like we should not be naive, there like are many people, many entities that are committed to preserving the racial order that defined Jim Crow. It didn't fall in uncontested. How else might you deploy race as a story?
Hmm.
And so this is a moment where you might actually move beyond white and black. And so if we're thinking of this racial narrative that we are telling, we've essentially had two characters. This character that is white, this character that is black. And the goal, the move might be to introduce a new character whose purpose is to further legitimize white black racial inequality. And so, who is that character? And that character is Asian. And now, what I'm not suggesting is that It is about all of the individuals living in the United States who are of Asian ancestry. And individuals who can trace their lineage back to Asia have been in the United States for hundreds of years, and almost always have confronted different forms of bias, discrimination, violence, often in extreme and deplorable ways. But the category Asian or Asian American that we know today has not always been with us. In many ways, it emerged in the post-civil rights era. And why did it emerge? Well, part of the reason why was to both explain and justify why we continue to see racial inequality between Americans racialized as white and those as black. And the question is, well, how? How does sort of this new racial character, Asian, um, do that work? Well, part of it is through the meaning associated with this category. And what are those like racial meanings? Well, it's stuff like industrious, hardworking, values education. And this is what many of us would recognize today as the model minority myth. Now, part of the point is that the model minority myth, which really just sort of essentializes the sort of deeply varied group that of individuals who are Asian Americans into this monolithic, very flat essentialist identity, didn't just come about, but it actually served a particular function. And you can trace this to stuff like a 1966 New York Times article by this sociologist, William Peterson, I think was out of Berkeley, who made the case that essentially that Japanese Americans had suffered the most discrimination among racial minorities, and yet they've achieved all this social status. And why did they? Well, it's because of their culture. And the purpose, or at least the consequence, if not the purpose, at a minimum, the consequence was to juxtapose good culture of these Asian American groups with quote unquote problem minorities.
Oh my God.
And part of what that explanation does, or part of what that racial story does, is it suggests that if certain groups continue to remain underrepresented, it's not because they face any number of structural systemic headwinds that we would think of as something like structural racism, but it's because they actually had bad culture. It's because they're not invested in education. It's because they're not committed to hard work. That story now remains with us. And so when we say that race tells the whole story, you don't actually need any facts, just think of the affirmative action litigation.
Right.
So if the goal, and this was the goal by the entities trying to prohibit affirmative action in higher education, if you want to simultaneously stigmatize affirmative action and legitimize the underrepresentation of Black or Latino students on college campuses and the overrepresentation of white students, well, how might you sort of weaponize racist story? And one way to do it is to actually make this character, this sort of racial category with associated meanings that is Asian, the face of your narrative. Because when you say that Asian Americans are harmed by affirmative action, you don't need facts. You're already telling a story that is going to be legible to most Americans because of the power of race as a source of meaning to help us understand the world. And you're essentially doing like three things, again, just by saying, just in a sentence, without actually having facts. You are activating all these different racial meanings. One, well, we know that Asian Americans have long confronted discrimination, but if they are doing well, certainly they figured it out. So maybe other groups should figure it out. In other words, the underrepresentation of certain groups is not because of structural forces like racism. It's because they're just not doing what Asian Americans are ostensibly doing. And then it's also a way to suggest that it's not about the admission system or the criteria. It's about the group.
Right.
And third, don't call me racist. Like I'm trying to represent Asian Americans. And I know we are out of time, so I've got to like get one last thing in. So the purpose, like, or the work that Asian is doing as this racial idea, I'm not talking about individual people. I'm talking about the idea that is, or the concept that is Asian or Asian American, is that it's telling a particular story. But it turns out, if you actually looked at numbers, you actually didn't want to engage in this essentialist exercise. Asian Americans are such a diverse group, and how could it be any other way? But what that means is that for historical reasons, as a function of like what led to immigration, how many generations people have been here, different sort of social advantages or disadvantages, you see a lot of variance with respect to whether specific Asian groups are high or low achievers just with respect to standardized tests. But that diversity within the Asian American community undercuts the story that Asian America is this one monolithic group that is a mono minority. And so what happens if you are trying in bad faith to justify racial inequality and you confront the reality that Asian America is really diverse? Well, you actually try to redefine what Asian America means, or Asian American. And this is actually, so what I'm going to state now is from a complaint from the same entity that is suing Harvard and UNC from their lawsuit against Yale, in part because Yale, like a number of institutions, actually tries to be more precise in recognizing that Asian Americans are a heterogeneous group. This is a footnote. Hereinafter, references to Asian applicants will exclude racially favored Asian applicants who identify, at least in part, as from favored Asian American subgroups, such as applicants who identify as Cambodian, Hmong, Laotian, or Vietnamese. What is happening here is that the party that is trying to use Asian America as a story to undercut affirmative action is having to reckon with the reality that this model minority myth that is Asian American, that we associate with Asian Americans, does not actually reflect the individuals in this country who we would think of as Asian American.
Oh my
and
God.
when you confront those facts, if your goal is not actually about remedying racial inequality, but rather justifying it, then you're actually going to redefine who is in that group so that the meaning serves the purposes that you want.
Oh my God. Thank you, Jonathan Feingold. This is Race Class, episode 11. Race is a story that justifies inequality. And now you know why Jonathan said, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Thank you so much for doing this and for joining me for a year. And I'm looking forward to the next year of us holding hands together and learning more. Today was a light bulb moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnie.
This is the Tuesday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Let's go back, way on, way back when. I didn't even know you couldn't have been too much more than 10.